Hey guys, go ahead and dim the lights, find your favorite blanket, and just settle in. Tonight, we're gonna step away from the marble palaces and the golden crowns for a bit. Instead, we're heading north, way north, to a place where the wind doesn't just blow, it screams. We're talking about the Viking Age, but not the part with the axes and the longships. Tonight, we're looking at how these people actually survived the months where the sun basically gave up and went on vacation. We're talking about turf houses. Because when the world is a frozen wasteland, the smartest thing to do is quite literally crawl under a blanket of dirt and stay there until April. So let's just float away to the North Atlantic and see how they did it. Now, when you think of a Viking home, you might imagine a sturdy wooden cabin. And sure, if you lived in Norway and had plenty of trees, that worked out fine. But then the Vikings decided to colonize places like Iceland and Greenland. These places had many things: glaciers, volcanic ash, sheep. But what they did not have was a lot of tall, sturdy timber. If you managed to find a tree in 9th century Iceland, it was probably
Easy
a
now,
birch
girl, there's
tree
plenty
that
more.
was about the
The
height of
fire's
a
low, I'll
toddler
stir it.
and twice as
Good.
flimsy.
The night's chill
You
is
weren't
coming.
building a great hall out of that. So the Vikings had to get creative. They looked at the ground, saw the thick, matted layers of volcanic soil and grass, and thought, yeah, that'll do.
Building a turf house wasn't just a style choice. It was a desperate, shivering necessity. The walls were often several feet thick, sometimes up to 6 feet of solid, compressed earth and roots. It's basically the original green architecture, mostly because it was actually made of green things. The genius of the turf house is that it's a giant thermal mass. It takes a long time to get cold, and once you get it warm, it stays that way. Of course, warm is a relative term. We're talking slightly above freezing while the sheep huddle in the corner warm. But hey, it beat dying in a snowdrift. Let's look at the layout of these places. You'd have the skalli, or the longhouse. It was essentially one giant smoky room where everyone did everything. You slept there, you ate there, you worked there, and you probably grew to intensely dislike your cousins snoring there. Along the walls, they built raised wooden platforms called palar. During the day, these were your chairs and your workbenches. At night, they were your beds. There was no privacy. If you wanted a private moment in the Viking Age, your best bet was going outside into a blizzard, which, funnily enough, most people didn't opt for. In the center of the room was the langeldur, or the long fire. This was the heart of the house. Because there were no chimneys, just a hole in the roof called a ljori, the room was constantly filled with a thin blue haze of peat smoke. It kept the bugs away and preserved the meat hanging from the rafters, and it also probably ensured everyone had a very raspy, "I've smoked 40 cigars a day" kind of voice by the time they were 20. But it was the only source of light and heat. And then there were the roommates. Since wood was scarce and every scrap of heat was precious, the Vikings often shared their living space with their livestock. Imagine a rainy Tuesday in October. You're sitting by the fire, trying to mend a tunic, and 3 feet away, a very damp, very confused cow is staring at you. The cows lived in a section called the fjós. The benefit here was simple. A cow is essentially a 1,200-pound space heater. They generate a massive amount of body heat. So if you could stomach the smell of manure and the occasional moo in the middle of the night, you stayed a few degrees warmer. It was a trade-off, a smelly, loud, hairy trade-off. The construction itself was a slow, meditative process. You'd cut the turf into specific shapes, sometimes klombrachnaus, which were like large diamond-shaped bricks of sod. You'd stack them in a herringbone pattern so the water would drain off. It was like playing a very muddy, very heavy version of Tetris. If you did it right, the grass would keep growing, and the roots would knit the whole house together into a single living organism. If you did it wrong, the wall would collapse on you during dinner, which was generally considered a bad start to the weekend. Over time, these houses became more complex. You'd have a series of smaller rooms connected by a long, dark tunnel. This was the Gangahas style. The tunnel acted as a series of airlocks to keep the freezing wind from hitting the living quarters. Walking through a turf house must have felt like being a mole. It was dark, it was damp, and it smelled like earth, smoke, and wet wool. But when you're on the edge of the Arctic Circle and the wind is trying to peel the skin off your face, a dark hole in the ground feels like a luxury hotel.
Life in the earth, and what was for dinner? Probably not lobster. All right, so we've got our turf house. It's thick-walled, smoky, and probably smells faintly of cow. Now, what does a day-to-day existence look like in this underground haven when the sun is a rumor and the only thing plentiful is snow? It's not exactly glamorous, folks. This wasn't a spa vacation. This was survival, spiced with a healthy dose of repetitive chores and existential dread. The rhythm of life inside a turf house, especially during winter, was dictated by the dwindling light and the constant battle against the cold. There were no light switches, no electric heaters, just the flickering, sooty glow of the Langolder. People would wake with the first hint of twilight, which in the depths of winter could be as late as 10 a.m. and barely last a few hours. The short days meant that most work had to be done by the firelight or by the light of a small, sputtering oil lamp made from a flat stone and some rendered animal fat, probably from a seal. Cozy. Chores were a constant. The women, as was often the custom, were the backbone of the household economy. They'd be busy spinning wool into yarn, weaving fabric on a vertical loom, and mending clothes. Imagine trying to thread a needle in near darkness with smoke stinging your eyes while a baby cries and a sheep coughs in the corner. It wasn't exactly a Pinterest-perfect craft room. The children, if they weren't freezing, would be helping with these tasks or learning the basic skills needed for survival. Childhood wasn't exactly a time for playdates and TikTok dances back then. Food was another constant preoccupation. Forget your 5 a day. Forget fresh produce entirely. What did Vikings eat in a turf house in Iceland during winter? Mostly it was meat, fish, and dairy products that could be preserved. Think dried fish, wind-cured meat like hakarl, the infamous fermented shark, which tastes exactly as pleasant as it sounds, and various forms of cheese or skyr, a thick yogurt-like dairy product. They also ate a lot of porridge made from barley or oats if they could grow them, or even from lichen scraped off rocks. Yes, rocks, because when you're truly desperate, anything that doesn't actively poison you is food. Imagine the meals, a communal pot over the fire, bubbling with some kind of stew made from whatever was on hand, probably mutton, dried fish, and perhaps some foraged wild roots or berries if it wasn't midwinter. The taste profile was functional. There weren't a lot of delicate spices or culinary experimentation. It was about calories and survival, not gourmet dining. And everyone would eat together, probably from wooden bowls, scooping the contents with their hands or a simple spoon. Table manners were probably more about not elbowing your neighbor than anything else. One of the most important aspects of winter survival was the storage of food. They'd have various caches outside, sometimes dug into the ground and lined with stone, or simply in colder, unused sections of the turf house. Meat and fish would be dried, salted, or smoked. These methods weren't just for flavor, they were essential for preventing spoilage in a world without refrigeration. If your winter stores ran out, you were in serious trouble. The prospect of starvation was a very real, very present threat, not some abstract concept. Personal hygiene was, well, let's just say it was less frequent than it is today. Water had to be fetched, often from a frozen stream, and heated over the fire. Bathing was a luxury, not a daily ritual. Most cleaning involved dry scrubbing and perhaps an occasional splash of water. The constant smoke probably acted as a sort of disinfectant, or at least covered up other smells. Clothing was thick wool and animal skins, which would be incredibly warm, but also incredibly difficult to clean. So everyone probably smelled vaguely of smoke, animal, and ode to Viking. It was just the way things were. The social dynamics within these close quarters are fascinating. Imagine a family of perhaps 6 to 10 people, plus livestock, all coexisting in a single, dimly lit, smoky room for months on end. There was no escaping each other. Disputes, arguments, and personality clashes were inevitable. You couldn't just storm off to your room and slam the door.
Your room was everyone else's room too, and slamming the door might bring down the roof. So conflict resolution likely involved a lot of quiet simmering and passive aggression, or perhaps a quick, decisive yell that echoed off the turf walls. Children in these turf houses would have grown up with a deep understanding of their environment and the constant struggle for survival. They weren't sheltered from the realities of life. They would see animals born and slaughtered, food prepared from raw ingredients, and the endless cycle of chores. Their education was practical, learning to identify plants, fish, and hunt, understanding weather patterns, and mastering the crafts needed to maintain the household. There was no room for idleness. Everyone had a role to play, and every hand was needed to ensure the family made it through the brutal winters. When the spring finally arrived, it must have felt like a miracle. The melting snow, the return of longer days, the sight of green shoots pushing through the earth. These weren't just pretty sights. They were signs of renewed hope and the promise of easier living, at least for a few months. The turf house, which had been a cozy, protective womb through the darkness, would then be opened up, aired out, and prepared for another cycle. It was a testament to human ingenuity and resilience, a stark reminder that even in the harshest environments, people found a way to not just exist, but to build a life, however humble and deeply rooted in the earth it might be. Let's take a moment to appreciate the sheer effort involved in all this. These aren't people complaining about a slow internet connection. These are people whose very existence hinged on knowing how to stack sod, how to preserve food, and how to tolerate their smelly cow neighbors for 6 months straight. It puts things into perspective, doesn't it? It was a hard life, but a life lived in profound connection with the land and its unforgiving rhythms.
The long dark, Viking myths, and the art of not going crazy. So, we've talked about the architecture of the turf house and the questionable menu options of a Viking winter, but now I want you to imagine the psychological weight of it all. Imagine the sun has been gone for weeks. Outside, the wind is howling so loudly it sounds like a literal frost giant is screaming at your front door. Inside, you are huddled in a room that is basically a very high-end hole in the ground. The air is thick with the scent of peat smoke and damp wool. This is where the real challenge began, the mental game of surviving the long dark. When you're trapped in a turf house for months, you don't just need food for your belly, you need food for your mind. This is exactly why the Vikings became some of the world's greatest storytellers. They didn't have Netflix, they didn't have books, and they certainly didn't have podcasts. What they had was the vaka, the long watch. As the fire crackled in the center of the room, the oldest person in the house would begin to speak. This is how the sagas were born. They weren't just history, they were survival tools. You'd listen to tales of heroes, monsters, and gods, and for a few hours, you weren't a shivering farmer in Iceland, you were with Thor, fighting the Midgard serpent. It was the original immersive entertainment, and it was the only thing keeping everyone from losing their minds. But let's be real, even the best stories can't hide the fact that you're living in a dirt sandwich. Because turf houses were built into the earth, they were constantly alive. This meant bugs, lots of them. Earthworms would occasionally fall from the ceiling onto your dinner. Beetles would crawl through the walls. It was a literal ecosystem. And then there was the dampness. Iceland isn't just cold, it's wet. The moisture from the ground would seep into the turf, and without constant fires, the walls would start to weep. Imagine waking up and finding your blanket is slightly soggy because the wall decided to have a little cry overnight. It's enough to make anyone a bit cranky. Now, let's talk about the snarky side of Viking social life. In such a small space, privacy was a myth. If you had a disagreement with your spouse, the entire household, including the cows, heard every word. This led to a very specific type of Viking humor, dry, biting, and incredibly sarcastic. If you read the sagas, the characters are constantly making these incredibly cold, witty remarks right before they die or do something drastic. That wasn't just artistic flair. That was the byproduct of living in a 20-foot room with 10 other people. You learned to use words as a weapon,
because you couldn't exactly walk away to cool off in a blizzard. And what about the kids? Growing up in a turf house meant you were basically an adult by age 12. There was no playtime in the way we think of it. A Viking child's toys were usually small wooden carvings of animals or tiny ships, but mostly their toys were tools. A young girl would be expected to master the drop spindle, turning raw wool into thread for hours on end. A boy would be learning how to sharpen a knife or fix a leaky roof. But there was a certain beauty in it, too. They lived in a world where they knew exactly where everything came from. They knew the sheep that provided their clothes. They knew the earth that formed their walls. There was no away. Everything was right there, recycled and reused until it literally fell apart. Let's float over to the sleeping arrangements again, because this is where the monotone life really peaks. You didn't have a mattress. You had a wooden bench covered in heather, straw, or, if you were lucky, a few sheepskins. It was firm, to say the least, and because heat rises, the people sleeping on the higher platforms were slightly warmer, while the kids and the less important guests slept closer to the cold, drafty floor. It was a literal social hierarchy based on how much body heat you could steal from the fire. As the winter dragged on into February and March, the cabin fever must have been intense. The Vikings called this time the Thori. It was the coldest part of the year when the food stores were at their lowest. This is when the weird traditions started. They had feasts to appease the old gods, eating things like boiled sheep's head, which, let's be honest, is a desperation meal rebranded as a celebration meal. You'd sit there staring at a sheep's face, thinking, only 6 more weeks until I see a blade of grass. It took a specific kind of mental toughness to stay calm, keep the fire going, and not get into a physical fight over who used the last bit of whale oil. The turf house was also a place of transition. Births happened here, usually in a quiet corner partitioned off by a woolen hanging. Deaths happened here too. When someone passed away during the winter, you couldn't exactly dig a grave in the frozen permafrost. Sometimes the body would have to be kept in a cold outbuilding until the spring thaw. It sounds morbid to us, but for the Vikings, death was just another neighbor. They lived so close to the edge of survival that there was no room for sentimentality. You mourned, you told a story about them by the fire, and then you got back to spinning wool, because if the wool didn't get spun, nobody stayed warm. The engineering of these homes really is the star of the show, though. Even with the dampness and the bugs, a well-built turf house could last for decades. Every few years, you might have to patch the roof by adding fresh sod, but for the most part, the house took care of itself. It sat low in the landscape, letting the wind glide right over it. While a wooden house might have its roof ripped off by a North Atlantic gale, the turf house just sat there, stubborn and silent. It was the ultimate architectural shrug to the elements. As we wrap up this part of our journey under the grass, just think about the silence. Once the stories were told and the fire died down to glowing embers, the only sound was the wind outside and the rhythmic breathing of a dozen people and animals inside. It was a world of darkness, yes, but it was also a world of profound closeness. You were never alone. For better or worse, you were part of a tiny, breathing island of warmth in a sea of ice. The thaw, the repair, and the evolution of the living roof. So, we've survived the long dark. The sun has finally decided to show its face for more than a lukewarm hour, and the ice is starting to lose its grip on the landscape. You'd think this would be the time for a Viking to kick back and relax, but in the world of turf house living, the arrival of spring just meant a different kind of work. It was time for the great airing out, or what we might call the most intense spring cleaning in human history. Imagine opening a door that hasn't been fully unsealed in months. The rush of cold, fresh Arctic air hitting that stagnant, smoky interior must have felt like a physical slap, but a welcome one. The first thing on the agenda was the roof. You see, a turf house is basically a living pet. During the winter, the grass on the roof goes dormant, but once the melt begins, the weight of the water becomes a serious problem.
If your drainage wasn't perfect, the ceiling would start to sag, and indoor rain would become your new reality. Men would climb up onto the roof, carefully so as not to fall through into the kitchen, to inspect the sod. They were looking for slumping, where the earth had shifted. They'd cut fresh patches of turf from the nearby meadows, hauling the heavy, dripping blocks up to replace the sections that had rotted or thinned out. It was a messy, back-breaking job, but if you skipped it, your house would literally melt back into the landscape by June. And then there was the floor. Remember how I mentioned the cows lived inside? Well, several months of bovine residency leaves let's call it a legacy. The floor of a Viking longhouse was usually packed earth covered with rushes or straw. By spring, that straw was a biohazard. The process of cleaning out the fjós, or the cattle section, was a task reserved for the brave and the stoic. This waste wasn't just thrown away, though. It was the most precious fertilizer they had. In a land with thin volcanic soil, that winter accumulation was the only reason the hay crop would grow high enough to feed the animals for the next winter. It was the ultimate circle of life, just a very, very smelly one. But spring wasn't just about chores, it was about the return of the light. As the days stretched out, the llori, the smoke hole in the roof, stopped being just a vent and started being a sunbeam. For a few hours a day, a bright square of light would track across the dark floor. People would move their work into that square of light, soaking up the vitamin D like moss on a rock. You can imagine the shift in the mood. The snarky, cramped tension of February began to dissolve into the frantic energy of May. There were seeds to plant, sheep to shear, and of course the ever-present repairs to the stone foundations that might have shifted during the frost heaves. As the centuries rolled on, the design of these houses didn't just stay static, they evolved. The Vikings were nothing if not adaptive. By the time we get into the later medieval period in Iceland, the longhouse started to morph into what historians called the burstabear. Instead of one giant, sprawling tunnel house, you started seeing a row of smaller, gabled buildings connected by a central corridor. Each room had its own front-facing wooden gable, often painted or carved. It looked a bit like a row of tiny houses huddled together for warmth. From the front, it looked like a village. From the back, it just looked like a series of grassy hills. This design was much more efficient for heat retention, and frankly, it gave people a tiny bit more privacy, which I'm sure helped the divorce rate significantly. Let's talk about the snarky evolution of the interior. As trade increased, the very wealthy started lining their turf walls with wooden panels. It was the Viking version of wallpaper. It kept the damp earth from touching your back, but it also became a canvas for incredibly intricate carvings. If you were a big deal in the 11th century, your turf house didn't just smell like dirt, it smelled like imported pine and beeswax. You'd have tapestries hanging to catch the drafts, and maybe even a few pieces of silver displayed on a shelf. It was still a hole in the ground, but it was a designer hole in the ground. The transition from the Viking Age turf house to the modern turf house is a long, slow glide through history. These structures stayed in use in Iceland all the way into the early 20th century. Think about that for a second. While the rest of the world was building skyscrapers and driving Model T Fords, some people were still living in houses made of grass and stone, like their ancestors did 1,000 years prior. Why? Because the environment hadn't changed. The wind was still screaming, the wood was still scarce, and the earth was the best insulator ever invented. It wasn't backwards, it was just the most logical way to live in that specific corner of the world. There's something incredibly humbling about the turf house. It's a building that doesn't try to dominate the landscape, it tries to disappear into it. When a turf house is abandoned, it doesn't leave a jagged ruin of concrete and steel. It just slowly sinks. The wood rots, the stones settle, and the grass grows over it until it's just a slightly suspicious-looking mound in a field. It's a very quiet, very dignified way for a home to die. It returns to the earth that it was borrowed from in the first place. As we look at these emerald green mounds today, preserved in places like Glaumbad or Skogod, we see them as something out of a fairy tale. We see them as cute or quaint. But tonight, as you're drifting off, try to remember the reality. Remember the weight of the damp sod, the sting of the peat smoke, and the sound of the wind that never, ever stops. These houses weren't built for aesthetics. They were built by a people who looked at a frozen, treeless island and said, "We can make this work." They didn't fight the earth. They climbed inside it. And maybe there's a lesson in that for us, in our glass and steel boxes. The Vikings knew that you can't beat the North Atlantic. You can only negotiate with it. And the price of that negotiation was a bit of dirt under your fingernails and a cow for a roommate. Not a bad deal, all things considered. It kept the fire burning, the stories flowing, and the blood moving until the sun finally decided to come home.
Secrets in the dirt and the archaeology of the everyday. So we've seen the house built, we've smelled the winter stew, and we've watched the spring repair. But now I want us to go deeper. To really understand the people who lived under the grass, we have to look at what they left behind. Not the gold hoards or the dragon-headed ships, but the stuff they dropped in the cracks of the floorboards. Because in a turf house, the floor was essentially a time capsule. When you're living on packed earth and straw, things get lost. A bone needle slips, a glass bead rolls away, or a small wooden toy gets buried in the rushes. For a Viking, it was a nuisance. For a modern archaeologist, it's a goldmine of mundane, beautiful reality. Let's talk about the midden. That's the fancy archaeological term for a trash heap. In the Viking Age, the midden was usually located just outside the main door, or sometimes in a designated pit. Because the soil in places like Iceland and Greenland is often cold and sometimes acidic or anaerobic, it preserves things that would rot away in a week in a tropical climate. When researchers dig into these mounds of ancient garbage, they find the real Viking history. They find thousands of animal bones, which tell us exactly what was for dinner in the year 950 AD. The bone records are actually quite snarky if you know how to read them. For example, in the early years of a settlement, you see lots of cattle bones. The Vikings were trying to live like prestigious Norwegian lords. But as the centuries go by and the climate gets colder, the cow bones disappear and are replaced by sheep and goat bones. It's the archaeological equivalent of watching someone realize their luxury lifestyle isn't sustainable and slowly switching to the budget version. Eventually, the bones of seals and fish dominate. It's a silent record of a people being humbled by the land they tried to conquer. But the most intimate finds are the personal items. One of the most common things found in the floors of turf houses is the comb. Vikings were actually surprisingly vain. They loved their hair. They carved beautiful, ornate combs out of reindeer antler or whalebone. Finding a broken comb in the dirt tells us that even in a smoky, damp hole in the ground, someone was sitting by the fire trying to get the tangles out of their hair and look a bit presentable for the neighbors. It's a very human touch in a very harsh world. Then there are the gaming pieces. The Vikings were obsessed with a board game called Hnefatafl. It was a game of strategy, a king trying to escape an ambush. Archaeologists find these pieces carved from stone, bone, or even walrus ivory, scattered in the dirt of the longhouse. You could almost see the scene. Two people huddled near the embers of the fire, arguing over a move while the wind rattles the door. These games weren't just for fun. They were a way to sharpen the mind when the body was trapped indoors. One of my favorite things ever found in a turf house excavation isn't a treasure at all. It's a piece of wood with runes scratched into it. Now, usually, we think of runes on giant, heroic standing stones. But in the turf house, runes were used for post-it notes. Archaeologists have found sticks that say things like, "Thorstein owns this," or even more hilariously, "Gita says you should come home." There's even one famously found in a different context that basically translates to, "This is high." It's just graffiti. It's the 10th century version of I Was Here. It reminds us that these weren't legendary figures from a poem. They were just people who got bored, people who left notes for their spouses, and people who wanted to claim their favorite beer mug. We also find evidence of the invisible workers, the slaves or thralls. In the larger turf houses, the layout often shows a distinct difference in quality between the main hall and the peripheral workrooms. The archaeology shows us the heavy grinding stones for grain, the loom weights for weaving, and the cramped quarters where the people who did the hardest work lived. It's a reminder that the cozy turf house had a very rigid social hierarchy. The warmth was shared, but the comfort was definitely not distributed equally. And let's not forget the magic found in the walls. Sometimes archaeologists find foundation deposits, objects buried under the threshold or in the corners of the turf walls to bring good luck or ward off evil spirits. It might be a small iron knife, a decorative bead, or even a horse skull. The Vikings were a deeply superstitious people. Living in a house made of the earth meant you were very aware of the land spirits or landviter. You didn't just build a house, you asked the earth for permission to stay. These hidden objects were the rent paid to the spirits of the soil. As we look at these bits of bone and broken combs, the monologue of the turf house becomes a conversation. It tells us that life was a series of small, repetitive actions. It was the sound of a spindle whirring, the scrape of a bone tool against leather, and the quiet scratch of a knife on wood. It was a life lived in the micro, because the macro, the weather, the ocean, the gods, was far too big and scary to control. The turf house, in the end, was a filter. It filtered out the deadly cold, it filtered out the screaming wind, and it left a small, concentrated space where human culture could survive. Every piece of charcoal in the hearth and every discarded fish scale in the midden is a testament to that survival. They didn't just stay in Iceland, they thrived in the cracks of the landscape. They turned the ground into a fortress. So, as we prepare to close this chapter on the underground life of the Vikings, just imagine those layers of history. Under every green mound in the North Atlantic, there is a floor of packed earth waiting to tell its story. It's a story of hair combs and gaming pieces, of fermented shark and smoky lungs, and of a people who were smart enough to know that if you want to beat the winter, you have to become a part of the earth itself.